Now that we've had a look at the why of advocacy, it's time to think about the how of communicating for advocacy. So those of you who were with us at the session in December will remember that we talked a lot about intention, knowing your intention when you speak publicly, and knowing your message, knowing what you want to communicate, and making sure that you're not thrown off course, that you're not distracted. Now, that's very true and very important, and it was particularly relevant to the subject of our session in December, which was speaking to the media. But I'd like to bring in another element today and look at kind of how we balance these two elements. The other element is empathy. So yes, when we communicate in the public arena, when we communicate for advocacy, it's important to be centered, to be focused on our own message, on what we want to get across, what our intention is for that particular communication. But it's also crucial and can be more or less crucial depending on the particular type of public speaking. It's also crucial to balance that intention with empathy. And by empathy, we mean an understanding of who our audience is, what they want to hear, what they're interested in, what they can invest in emotionally or concretely, what they can get on board with, what initiatives will inspire them. All of those things constitute empathy when it comes to communication. And so I think in general, it's crucial to balance those two elements. And I think it's crucial as well to think about how we balance them differently depending on the type of communication that we're looking at. So as we were saying back in December, if we're speaking to the media, if we're talking about a radio interview, for example, we might want to be stronger on our intention. And why is that? Well, because of course, in the case of a radio interview, we have an interviewer, a journalist sitting in front of us, and that person is a very good example of a frenemy, someone who can be our friend, but can also be our enemy. They can be our ally, they're giving us a platform, an opportunity to speak, but their agenda is not necessarily 100% aligned with ours. They might want to get an angle on the story that we don't agree with. They might want to get a controversial quote from us that we don't want to give. So in the case of a radio interview or any engagement with the media, really, it's crucial to be perhaps a little more focused on our intention, our message, and not to get sidetracked by difficult questions. We'll have a look at how we avoid difficult questions more concretely in just a moment. Somewhere in the middle, we might have an activity like a project presentation. You have a new idea, you want to share it with someone who can help you realize that idea, whether that's, for example, a superior who can allocate time and resources, a funder who can allocate some money, a partner who can join the initiative. I think in the case of a project presentation, it's fair to say that we want to locate ourselves somewhere in the middle of that spectrum between intention and empathy. Know what we want, but also know what the audience might want or might be interested in, and find that place where our agendas, where our interests overlap. That's really where the magic happens in that particular type of communication. Or we might be planning something like a campaign. It could be a campaign online, on social media, a newsletter campaign, an advertising campaign on a bus or in schools. It could be anything. But with a campaign, what we really are trying to do is not just communicate our message, but also engage a certain audience. And in that case, we really do have to move further towards the empathy end of the spectrum. So this is the situation where we might be doing some market research or kind of doing some polls, conducting some, sending out some questionnaires, for example, to find out what is it that our audience is interested in and how can we design this campaign so that, yes, of course, we stay true to the essence of what we want to communicate, what our intention is, but also importantly, perhaps a little more importantly in this case, we really communicate in a way that's exciting, that's engaging to the audience we want to reach, and that motivates them to participate in whatever we want them to do. So I think as we think about the how of communicating for advocacy, I think it's important to note that how we communicate will differ depending on the type of communication, the type of activity. And I think this idea of a sort of intention to empathy spectrum can be really useful as a guideline in terms of where we locate ourselves, where we start the journey of communication. Now, let's get to some concrete tips, and those of you who were with us in December will recognize some of this, but I think with this kind of practical guidance, it's always useful to have a refresher, because these are things that are kind of easy to talk about and then difficult to remember when it actually comes to communicating, when it comes to public speaking. I find them difficult to remember too, because when it comes to public speaking, often we can be overwhelmed by the adrenaline. Speaking publicly can be very exciting, can be a little nerve-wracking, and it's very difficult to bear in mind that kind of structure of preparation that we might have theoretically been studying and be ready to put in place. So when we prepare for public speaking, there are two really key elements that we want to think about. One is the result that we want to achieve, and the other is the impression that we want to make. So what is the result that we want to achieve? Well, again, we have these key questions. Who do you want to reach? Who's your audience? What do you want them to know? What's your message, your intention? And what do you want them to do? How can you, again, engage them, invite them to participate, motivate them to remember what you said and perhaps to act upon it as well? And in terms of making an impression, again, a few key questions that we can ask are, how do I want to come across? This sounds like an obvious question, but actually I think it bears some scrutiny, because just like intention and empathy can be balanced differently in different situations, the impression that we want to make might also be different in different situations. So if I'm going to speak to a journalist who I know has a reputation for asking some very tough questions, maybe I want to come across a bit less friendly and a bit more self-contained. I'm not saying intimidating, but if this is someone who is likely to try and intimidate me, the impression that I want to make is certainly a strong one, a firm one. If, on the other hand, I'm communicating with someone who's likely to feel maybe a bit nervous about meeting me, then of course I want to make the opposite impression. Depending on the situation, I might want to come across as extremely friendly, very approachable, very open, but all of those things can vary depending on the situation. And really, when we think about how we want to come across, I think what I'm trying to say is a key element of communication is also reflecting on power. Do I have, what kind of power do I have in relation to the person that I'm communicating with? Do I need to set them at ease, or do I need to hold my own? Do I want to open a space for them, or am I trying to assert a space for myself, create a space for myself or for others? Those questions about power, those reflections on power dynamics, I think are a crucial part of preparing the impression that we want to make. And then other things that we might want to reflect on when we think about the impression that we're preparing to make. What do I need to remember? What are the really key things that I need to remember about this situation? If there's 3 things that I'm going to take with me into this event, into this workshop that I'm presenting, what are those 3 key things? And what do I want to avoid? And we'll talk a bit more about avoiding difficult questions, but I might also want to avoid seating next to each other 2 people who I know don't agree when I'm convening a meeting of partners. Or, it doesn't have to be something that I want to avoid saying. It could also be something that I want to avoid doing. So once I've thought about achieving a result and making an impression, the really key thing, I think, when it comes to that moment of communicating is the connection. How do I create that connection with the person that I'm speaking to that makes me memorable and engaging, that has them leave the session, leave the kind of space thinking, wow, I enjoyed that, I learned something, I want to go back, I want to do it again. How do I create that connection? Well, a few tips. Firstly, own the story. So be authentic. Talk about your lived experience and express it in your own words. It's difficult to be engaging when you're talking about something that you don't fully believe in, that you don't fully understand, or that you don't fully own. So be authentic, be your true self. Of course, you know, we've just been talking about how advocacy often requires translation, depending on the situation that you're going to advocate in. You can't always be 100% your true self, depending on the space in which you're communicating, but certainly be as authentic as possible. What creates connection is the sense that, you know, that the other person is coming from a place of authenticity. Secondly, impress the listener, be memorable. In this day and age, we're so bombarded with information, constantly with kind of input, with different types of communication, that it's very difficult to make yourself memorable. And one way to do that is to think about delivering sound bites over sermons. So, you know, keep it snappy, keep it catchy, you know, use a metaphor if that makes you more memorable, use an example if that makes you more memorable. Think about what you can do to impress, to stand out. And finally, simplify and repeat. Less is more, and twice is better than once. Less is more, and twice is better than once. Not much to add to that, really, just that keep it simple, keep it clear, and repeat it if needs be. So how do we make that impression in the kind of way that we communicate, as well as the things that we're communicating? A few tips, and again, these are easier said than done. It's easy to write these things down on paper. It's difficult to do them in the moment with the adrenaline flowing. But certainly a few things that we can do are enunciate, so to speak clearly, to emphasize key words, to remember that you might be speaking to non-native speakers, or in the case of this session, for example, I'm trying to constantly bear in mind that I'm speaking to interpreters as well, and they need to have the time to translate what I'm saying. Express. Practice your lines until they sound natural. Nobody loves a robot. And again, this is about authenticity. You know, the more you can create a human connection, an organic connection with your audience, that makes them feel like they're part of a real story, a real journey, a real person's life, the easier it will be to engage them, to invite them to participate. Project. This is another very practical, very basic tip. It's better to be too loud than too quiet. And this is especially true online. People can always turn the volume down if you're speaking too loudly, but if they can't hear you, they can't hear you. So if in doubt, speak up. And the key one, relax. There's all sorts of things that we do unconsciously with our bodies that can change the way that we speak, make us harder to understand, make it more difficult to communicate with us. And the only thing we can really do is try and be conscious of those things that we do unthinkingly. Am I clenching my fists? Unclench your fists. Do I have my legs crossed? You can't see me, but as I say this, I did have my legs crossed. So I'm uncrossing them right now. Keep breathing. Of course, we breathe very differently when we're nervous, and to keep breathing, especially to keep breathing out, is key when we're speaking in public. And smile. Smiling is a fascinating trick that you can play on yourself, because smiling is something that we all do as humans, as animals, we all do when we feel happy. So the chemical kind of reactions generated by something happy are the reactions that make us smile without doing it on purpose. But we can trick our body, and if we smile, we can, and I promise this is actual scientific research, says that if we smile, we can trick our body into a reverse feedback loop where we feel some of those happy hormones, some of those happy chemicals. So smile, even if you don't feel happy, even if you don't feel relaxed, and you can feel a little bit better. Now, one of the kind of key points that always comes up in preparing for public speaking is, how do I avoid a question that I don't want to answer? And this is true for any type of public speaking. It's very true when you're being interviewed, so it's very true in relation to the media, but I think it's true of anything. Anyone can ask you a difficult question. You know, the funder who you're presenting your project to might ask you a difficult question about how you're going to run the project, or you know, the partner that you want to engage with on a certain type of advocacy might be asking you a tricky question, something that you're not allowed to talk about, or something that you don't really want to share at that moment. So there's a kind of three-part structure that I think is really helpful when we're troubleshooting, when we're kind of trying to step away from a tricky, from a dangerous area in any kind of conversation. One thing that we can do very easily, and that makes a huge difference in terms of how we react, in terms of how we come across when faced with a difficult question, is just acknowledging that question. Because the knee-jerk response, the instinctive reaction, is to pretend that we haven't heard it if we can't deal with it. But actually that doesn't look great. It doesn't look great on camera, it doesn't look great in a meeting, it doesn't look great. So the first thing that we can do to kind of make ourselves feel calmer and look better is just acknowledge that the question has been asked. And then we want to create a bridge. We want to change direction, bridge away from the thing that we don't want to focus on and back to our intention. So we want to return to our key message, to the thing that we really want to communicate. And we have a few examples here. So faced with a difficult question in whatever type of meeting, whatever you're communicating on, you might say something like, I can't comment on that. I'm acknowledging that the question has been asked. But what you should know, and these are those little bridging phrases that we want to practice, that we want to have ready, what you should know is that our work currently focuses on something else, and that's returning straight to my key message. Or we might say, I can't speak to what the Vatican has said. If the Pope, for example, has said something that's considered a little bit controversial, or someone is trying to get us to express a controversial opinion on it, we might say, I can't speak to what the Vatican has said, but, and here's our bridging phrase, the key thing to remember, and then we're back to our message, is that at UISG, or in my congregation, or, you know, as part of this initiative. Or one more example, we can say, I'm not the best person to answer that question. We're never obliged, we're never we're never obligated to answer a question that we feel is not for us, that someone else should be taking. So you can say, I'm not the best person to answer that question. What I do know, and there's my little bridge back to my intention, back to my message, is that I'm here today to talk about such and such. Now, today, speaking is really often speaking online. So before we come to our next breakout session, I wanted to talk briefly about a few things we can do to make it easier for ourselves to present online, to speak online, just to communicate really online, which so many of us are doing so much of the time. A few key things, and again, these are simple, but kind of good to keep a list of because they're also easy to forget. Avoid interruption, find somewhere quiet where you won't be disturbed. Think about lighting. Good lighting makes a lot of difference. Make sure that your face is clearly visible and that if possible, it's evenly illuminated. The classic mistake is to sit by a window thinking that the light is good, and it's very good on one side of your face and the other side of your face is in complete darkness. That looks a little bit monstrous. So avoid interruption, find some good lighting, make eye contact. Now, this one is very difficult, and I've actually been thinking about this a lot through this very presentation, because the instinct, especially on Zoom, is to look at the face of someone that you're speaking to. So I've been looking at Patrizia here, but I know that when I look at Patrizia, I'm not looking you fully in the eye. Whereas for me, it feels very strange and a little bit counterintuitive to be looking at this little camera circle on my laptop. It doesn't feel totally natural, and of course you don't want to be, doing that so fixedly that you're distracting yourself from the actual speaking, from the actual presentation. But it's important to remember as well that eye contact is key, that it's very difficult to make eye contact through a screen, but precisely because it's difficult, it's important to try. Body language, of course, as well as eye contact, is another key element, and something that becomes harder when we're online. So remember that you're always on screen. That's an important one. You might be in a meeting, you might not have spoken for 45 minutes, you might be very bored, but you're always on screen. And remember to smile, remember to relax, do those things that can help you feel more at ease. And finally, technical issues. Prepare, rehearse, all the things that we've done before the session, but also relax, because no matter how much you prepare and no matter how much you rehearse, technology can reach there. Great. I think we can say goodbye. Is there anything I've missed?
Yes, I think so, even though we like to be here together.
Yes.
So we can stay. Oh, I can unmute all people so we can just thank and